So when I talk to instructors about how we spend our time at the beginning of a Principles of Economics class, almost all of us spend a lot of time trying to get the supply, demand, and equilibrium stuff right.
Because that's the foundation that we're laying for students to be able to build on all the other concepts we want to teach them in economics.
So the rest of economics is going to be either applying this idea to particular markets, thinking about the labour market or the market for foreign exchange or commodity markets or the market for capital. It's all supply, demand, and equilibrium. Or it's going to be extending these ideas and enriching them as we think about imperfect competition and the like. But if they don't understand the base model, how are they going to tweak it or how are they going to learn to apply it? So it's critically important that we build that solid foundation.
And that's why we have 3 chapters where we go through individually demand in one chapter, supply in another chapter, and equilibrium, bringing the 2 together in yet a 3rd chapter. This 3-chapter treatment gives us the space to lay out a more complete understanding of these very important foundational concepts.
And so we start with a chapter on demand. Students actually find this fairly intuitive. They're used to buying things. The idea that a higher price leads them to buy a lower quantity is pretty straightforward, so they immediately get the demand curve. We show them how they can apply the core principles of economics in order to make better buying decisions. And if you do that, you'll keep buying. You'll follow the rational rule for buyers. In which you'll keep buying as long as the marginal benefit exceeds the price, which means you'll keep buying until
the marginal benefit is equal to the price, and there we get our demand curve.
So then students have this deep understanding of a demand curve. A demand curve is a marginal benefit curve. That's going to be tremendously helpful. Later on, we want to apply this idea to labour economics. What is the marginal benefit of hiring one more worker, for instance? Or when we want to teach welfare economics, the triangles. If I understand a demand curve as a marginal benefit curve, the triangles start to make sense.
So, of course, one of the other things that you see students often struggle with is trying to think about the difference between movements along the curve and shifts of the curve. And of course, once again, we're able to turn to the core principles to help them see this. The
answer here is simple, which is if you understand a demand curve is a marginal benefit curve, a price change doesn't change my marginal benefits. So therefore a price change won't shift the curve. It's a movement along. And that then also gives the students a real clue. They don't need to remember a long list of things that might shift a demand curve. They just need to think, is this going to change my marginal benefits? And if it does, it'll shift the curve.
And what shifts demand curves is everything that comes out of the interdependence principle. So we're able to tell them, think about that 4th principle. Is anything in that 4th principle changing? If so, your demand curve is shifting.
So that's demand. Do we want to go for a deeper treatment of supply?
I find students struggle with supply a lot more than they struggle with demand. I mean, demand is intuitive. They think of themselves as a consumer. But I have to really tell them, hey, you actually are a supplier, and I want you to think about what you're willing to sell at each price, your decisions and your supply curve. What do you supply?
Well, so they supply their time. At Michigan, they supply football tickets on the used ticket market over at StubHub. Lots of them supply stuff on Craigslist, on eBay, and so on. Keep going. I tell my students, I hope you're supplying attention right now. Keep going and they'll come to see themselves as suppliers. That in turn creates a hunger from them to think about how they can make better supply decisions.
And then once again, we're going to turn to those core principles to help them think about asking them on the margin, not how many hours should I work? Should I work 1 more hour? Applying the cost-benefit principle, thinking about the cost versus the benefits, and of course the opportunity cost. What else would they be doing with their time if they weren't working? We put these together and it implies another rational rule, this time the rational rule for sellers, which says supply 1 more if the price is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. And that's going to get us our upward sloping supply curve where supply is equal to marginal cost.
Right, so then my students, and this has been incredibly helpful, leave this chapter with a deep understanding that supply is the marginal cost curve. And that in turn is going to give them a whole lot of clues about things that might shift the supply curve. The question for them is, does it shift your marginal costs? If it does, it'll shift the supply curve.
So the last chapter is equilibrium, where we bring these things together, where supply meets demand, and we take them through the role of markets and bringing these 2 together and allowing for mutually beneficial trades where both people benefit, and bring supply and demand together to show them about equilibrium quantities and prices.
And we want them to think expansively about markets. We call it a market metaphor. So it's not just that they're buying gasoline or jeans or cups of coffee. We ask them to think about the marriage market or think about the market for votes. The set of ideas they're learning are much more broadly applicable than you would traditionally think about.
And we want them to be able to think about market changes, predicting market changes, understanding what happens when you shift the demand and supply curve inside of markets. And we want to walk them through a set of examples so that they see how it's done and then give them a chance to shift these curves and see what happens in equilibrium.
This is a great payoff for the students. So rather than feel like they've just done a death march through economic theory,
they're going to use it and actually make predictions about what's going to happen as the economy changes.
all of a sudden economics feels useful. Whenever things change, they now have a framework to forecast how it'll change and affect their lives. So that's what it is. It's a 3-chapter treatment of supply, demand, and equilibrium that then leaves our students prepared for the rest of semester. Look, if they don't understand this stuff, and later on in the semester, when we first teach it, and later on we try and teach them about the supply and demand of currencies or of labor or of capital, it'll be like speaking a foreign language to them. So let's get this material right the first time, give them the tools to succeed through the rest of semester.
And that's what will make sure that all your students are ready to go on to the next set of material, because I've found that I've got really bright students who come in with strong intuition about economics. They could move to advanced material really quickly, but I'd be leaving behind a large chunk of my class. By taking the time to build a solid foundation, I'm going to bring all students to the next material so we can engage in some of the really important issues in modern economics.
That's it.